Duke Nukem is a name that's ubiquitous with either joke or half-assed add-on these days, but at one point the brand was associated with quality games. Beginning from its humble roots of two kick-ass side-scrollers, Duke Nukem exploded in popularity in 1996 with Duke Nukem 3D. Developed by 3D Realms, Duke 3D reinvented the franchise from a Commander Keen type experience to a Doom-style first-person shooter, powered by Ken Silverman's then impressive build engine. While similar to Doom, Duke stylistically set itself apart in a few different ways. Instead of the metal-inspired satanic imagery filling the Doom games, Duke 3D fancies itself a love letter to 80s action and sci-fi flicks. It's loaded with references to different pieces of genre fiction, like They Live, Aliens, the 1969 moon landing, and Army of Darkness. The game's cover directly mirrors that movie's poster. Speaking of the third Evil Dead movie, Nukem himself acts as another joking reference piece. He's a mixture of Ash Williams, John Matrix, and Rowdy Roddy Piper's nameless hero in They Live, with a little hint of Dirty Harry thrown in. He's a gun-loving, stripper-ogling, steroid-popping man's man, and this kind of over-the-top machismo is the kind of humor that Duke 3D is filled with. It's a crass, testosterone-fueled parody romp that has its tongue firmly planted within its cheek. I mean, it's a game where the main character takes a poop down an enemy's neck after you ripped its head off. Despite the clear irreverence of the game's tone, Duke 3D was subject to a little bit of controversy on release due to its violence and sexual content. Censored releases were put on the market in response, but as we're looking back at Duke 3D, a question arises. Does it still hold up as a quality shooter on its own, ignoring the novelty of all the references, gags, and titillation? Let's find out. Duke Nukem 3D is extremely similar to Doom, there's no denying that. Id Software set the template that 3D Realms would follow closely. The levels are split into 3 separate campaigns, with the 4th episode being added later on in a re-released version. The individual levels themselves are somewhat large, semi-open environments where the player has to get from point A to point B, collecting 3 color-coded key cards along the way and fighting all sorts of enemies in their path. The key cards even have the same red, blue, and yellow color scheme. The player's health and armor system is identical, with 100 being the default cap for each and a power-up allowing the health cap to be raised to 200. Even more than some of the other Doom engine games, Duke Nukem 3D really was building on top of the foundation that Doom laid out. Duke 3D really isn't innovative, but what makes Duke special was how it spun the familiar beats of Doom to make them its own. Duke 3D uses the same basic weapons roster established in Doom. You have the pistol, shotgun, automatic weapon, rocket launcher, and the last designated super weapon slot, the BFG being replaced by the Devastator in this game. All of these are punchy and fun to use, with a lightning-fast firing rate. Even the starting pistol remains useful to some extent on the mid-tier enemies all throughout the campaigns. What really makes the weapons in Duke 3D interesting are the ones that aren't limited to imitating Doom's arsenal. One of the traits of all 3 of the big build engine games are the more experimental guns in each. These in Duke 3D include the Shrinker and Expander, the Freeze Ray, which turns enemies to ice and able to be shattered with a single kick, and then we have the 2 bomb items, the Pipe Bomb and the Laser Trip Mine. As a whole, while these state-changing guns really are just slightly more roundabout ways of killing enemies like the traditional ones, the variety is nice and pretty impressive for the time, especially the Shrink Ray. The 2 bombs are interesting as well. While the Laser Trip Mine isn't that useful for the single-player campaign, the Pipe Bomb is a cornerstone item for Duke's weapon loadout. It's a bomb you can place, throw around corners, or just lob in front of you for a quick kill. Really, the only issue I have with it were the occasionally wonky physics of it. Just look at this here, where I try to cheese out this Battle Lord by throwing bombs from the vent. However, it's understandable that one of the earlier attempts at throwing grenades in a first-person shooter would have a few kinks here and there. Duke's level design itself is also very solid, one of the true highlights of the game as a whole. 3D Realms had a bit of a different approach to designing maps than id Software did. Doom had relatively complex mazes rendered in an abstract manner, not meant to really look like something in real life. Scott Miller of 3D Realms put the team's idea for a level design this way. With Duke 3D, unlike every other shooter that came before, we wanted to have sort of real-life locations, like a cinema theater, strip club, bookstores. This was actually a pretty cool idea for setting Duke's locales apart from the competition, without sacrificing the quality of the levels themselves. The structure of Duke's levels are just like Doom's, but due to its attempts to be a vague facsimile of real-life locations, it kind of plops itself on the middle of the level design spectrum between Wolfenstein 3D's abstract labyrinths and something like Half-Life's semi-real environments. Duke Nukem 3D's levels are at their strongest when they're trying to replicate real places, with wide open spaces that the player can roam around in. It's for these reasons and more that I found the game's second episode, Lunar Apocalypse, to be the weakest portion of the game. The moon-based levels start looking more like the less realistic id-style levels, but replacing the stellar art style of something like Doom with boring gray corridors for the most part. On top of that, levels are generally more cramped, and the single worst enemy of the game is introduced here. The Sentry Drones are infamous for how much they blow. Drones are fast, durable, and do an insane amount of damage once they unleash their kamikaze attack and blow up on contact. Add the whole suicide bomber aspect with how they're common enemies in the most cramped environments, and you're gonna have a bad time. Fortunately, these things are mostly absent from the third episode, Shrapnel City, and in general, the game returns to the style of levels seen in episode 1, LA Meltdown. The first and the third episodes really are the peak of Duke 3D. Also, like in Doom, each of Duke 3D's episodes ends in a boss fight, with even the first episode's boss returning and the next two as a semi-regular enemy. All three are just big things that you fire upon until they cease to live, but despite the similarity in strategy, Duke's bosses are much weaker than even Doom's simple fights. As petty as it sounds, the Doom environments feel more carefully considered than those in Duke. The Barons of Hell have wide open space for the player to avoid their fireballs, the Cyber Demon has the pillars acting as cover to block its rockets, and the Spider Mastermind has that central building to avoid line of sight from its hit scan attack. In Duke 3D, all are just in wide open environments, though at least the Cycloid Emperor was in a large football stadium, so that's cool. Hell, the Battlelord fight is easily the worst example, with a large hit-scanning enemy being placed in a wide open room, the only cover being a hill in the room's center. First-person shooter boss fights are pretty famous for being kinda lousy, and these guys certainly enforce that reputation. However, not all of Duke 3D is just a riff on things Doom did. It actually had a fair bit of inventive features that id's games didn't. For instance, Duke might be the first FPS with a dedicated melee attack key, the game's Mighty Boot attack that can be used at any time no matter what weapon is equipped. You can even furiously do jump kicks while shooting enemies, just to get a little bit more damage in there. However, Duke 3D's real claim to fame is its interactive environments, which are actually pretty damn impressive. It's fun to see just how many things you can play around with in the levels. You can play pool, sing karaoke, drink from water fountains, give money to my pure and loving wife Jill Valentine. There's a fair bit going on to discover. This kind of attention to detail is both needless and incredibly charming, and it really went to show the passion that went into Duke 3D, even its smallest aspects. Probably the most interesting addition to Duke 3D was the rotating inventory the player can cart around with them at all times. A mixture of power-ups and utility items, these can range from a portable medkit, protective boots that protect Duke from taking damage in harmful floors like lava or acid, scuba gear that lets you swim indefinitely until the oxygen runs out, to the jetpack. This last one is the most interesting, allowing the player to fly around the game's admittedly fairly large maps. And with proper rationing of the fuel, crafty players can even save it to try and get around maps faster than intended. Looking at the inventory as a whole, most of them remain useful from the beginning of the game to the very end, with some being downright vital. On top of that, making a run-and-gun action game using an inventory the player can employ at any time was a pretty inspired choice, if not an entirely original one, with games like System Shock predating it. In the end, it's clear to see how Duke Nukem 3D rides on the back of Doom. In a lot of ways, it can pretty accurately be referred to as the old derogatory label of a Doom clone. It's working very, very closely from the template id Software developed, this much is undeniable. However, as it usually is, the devil's in the details here. From how we went over the ways that the game playfully riffs on the formula to what it does on its own, Duke doesn't feel like a Doom wannabe as you play it. From its presentation to level design focus, unique weaponry, and clever forward-thinking decisions, Duke Nukem 3D manages to carve a path out on its own. It's a worthwhile shooter in its own right and still holds up when put under scrutiny. Looking back, there was clearly a reason people would always want to bet on Duke. And then, as it always does, it all came